The Intergalactic Diplomatic Academy floated in the void between star systems like a monument to civilized discourse, which was ironic considering that most of its students could barely manage civilized conversation without threatening to devour each other. Harmony's Edge, as the station was optimistically named, housed the galaxy's most prestigious training ground for future ambassadors, mediators, and professional argument winners. It was also, coincidentally, home to some of the largest egos in known space, which was saying something in a universe where entire species measured self-worth by how many solar systems they could intimidate. Captain Maya Chen stood precisely 5 feet 2 inches in her regulation diplomatic heels, making her roughly the height of most aliens' kneecaps. This dimensional disparity wasn't lost on her fellow students, who seemed to find her presence as amusing as a dancing pet. The cosmic joke was that she'd outscored everyone on the theoretical diplomacy exams, but apparently theoretical knowledge carried about as much weight in galactic politics as a feather in a black hole. The morning artificial sunlight streamed through the Academy's observation decks, illuminating Conference Hall Alpha, where the final arbitration challenge would determine which students earned coveted positions in the Galactic Trade Consortium. The air hummed with tension and the subtle electromagnetic field generated by various alien nervous systems, creating an atmosphere that could charitably be described as diplomatically hostile. "Observe the diminutive human specimen," rumbled Ambassador Kronos, a titan whose shadow could eclipse small moons. His voice carried the sort of bass resonance that made lesser beings' bones vibrate in submission. "She appears to be taking notes." "How quaint." The Serpentine Naga delegation found this observation particularly entertaining, their Queen Vexthara uncoiling her impressive 30-foot length in what passed for laughter among her people. "Perhaps the humans sent her as a cultural exchange," she hissed, forked tongue tasting the air for signs of weakness. A living example of their species' adorable limitations. The crystalline Xerians chimed their amusement in harmonious frequencies that would have been beautiful if they weren't so condescending. Their representative, Resonance Prime Kethva, refracted light through his translucent form in patterns that suggested barely contained mirth. One must admire their optimism, he crystallized in his peculiar musical speech. Sending such a compact negotiator to compete with actual diplomats. Maya continued reviewing her cultural briefings with the methodical precision of someone who understood that preparation mattered more than presentation. Her silence only encouraged more commentary from her classmates, who apparently mistook quiet observation for intimidation. The insectoid hive speakers clicked and buzzed among themselves, their compound eyes analyzing her from multiple angles simultaneously. Even the energy-based photon collective seemed to flicker with what might have been cosmic amusement. What none of them realized was that Maya had spent the past 2 years not just studying negotiation theory, but studying them. Every species had behavioral patterns, cultural triggers, psychological blind spots that they advertised like diplomatic credentials. The Titans relied on physical intimidation, the Nagas on hypnotic persuasion, the Xerians on logical superiority. They were all playing the same game with different rulebooks, which was fascinating since humans had written several entirely different games. "Attention, diplomatic candidates," announced Director Vextar, a scarred veteran whose voice could make peace treaties sound like war declarations. "Today's final arbitration challenge will test your ability to navigate complex multi-party negotiations under pressure. You will resolve a 5-way dispute over mining rights to the newly discovered Zenith system." He gestured toward the holographic display where a star system materialized in all its contested glory. "The candidate who demonstrates superior diplomatic skill will receive appointment as junior ambassador to the Galactic Trade Consortium. The rest of you will serve in whatever backwater postings need filling." The betting pools had already started, with odds running heavily against the human. Maya had heard the whispered wages, the casual dismissals, the outright speculation about whether she'd lost 5 minutes in actual negotiations. Some of the more charitable aliens gave her credit for participating, which was somehow more insulting than direct mockery. The practice negotiations began with predictable results. During the resource allocation exercise, Kronos simply announced his species' superior claim and waited for others to acknowledge reality. Queen Vexthara used subtle pheromone manipulation to cloud opponents' judgment while weaving hypnotic speech patterns. When Maya's turn came, she attempted a collaborative approach that was immediately steamrolled by louder, larger, and more traditionally aggressive negotiators. Well, chimed Kethva, his crystalline form refracting smugness in visible spectrums, the human certainly brings an interesting perspective to diplomacy. Passive, but interesting. The territory mediation exercise proved equally educational for those studying the fine art of civilized intimidation. The various species demonstrated their preferred approaches to conflict resolution, which invariably involved some combination of threats, displays of superiority, and barely veiled suggestions of violence. Maya's attempts at finding common ground were noted, filed under adorable human naivety, and promptly ignored. "Poor little creature," rumbled Kronos, his voice carrying the casual condescension of beings who'd never needed to develop subtlety. "Perhaps humans are better suited to clerical work. Document filing requires no actual authority." The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, exactly, just the natural response of apex predators encountering something that didn't fit their understanding of the food chain. It was the sound of beings who'd built their entire diplomatic philosophy around the principle that might makes right and couldn't imagine any alternative approach actually working. As the practice sessions concluded, Maya settled into her assigned preparation area to review her notes. This was where things got interesting, or would have been if her fellow candidates had possessed even a fraction of her analytical capabilities. The exercises were designed to test negotiation skills under pressure, but what they actually tested was each species' preferred method of getting their way. The patterns were becoming clear. Every species approached diplomacy as an extension of their evolutionary advantages. The Titans used their size to intimidate, the Nagas used biochemical manipulation, the Xyrians used intellectual superiority. Even the hive speakers relied on collective decision-making that overwhelmed individual opposition. They were all essentially playing rock-paper-scissors with increasingly elaborate rocks. Maya's approach had been consistently dismissed as weak, passive, ineffective. Which was fine, because she hadn't actually been trying to win the practice rounds. She'd been collecting data. Diplomatic candidates, announced Director Vextar the following morning. Today's final arbitration challenge will determine your future careers. The scenario: 5 competing claims to mining rights in the Zenith system. Each of you represents a different faction with legitimate but conflicting interests. The holographic briefing materialized around them, displaying a star system rich in rare minerals that every galactic civilization desperately needed. The political situation was a nightmare of overlapping claims, historical grievances, and mutual antagonisms that would challenge even experienced ambassadors. Maya drew the weakest starting position, representing the Minor Trade Federation, a collection of small worlds with minimal military strength and negligible political influence. Her opponents included Kronos for the Titan Empire, Vexthara for the Naga Consortium, Kethva for the Xyrian Collective, and BuzzClick17 for the Hive Worlds. On paper, she was completely outclassed. "This should be entertaining," hissed Queen Vexthara, her serpentine form coiling in anticipation, watching the human attempt actual diplomacy with real stakes. "Indeed," crystallized Kethva, his harmonic voice carrying mathematical certainty. "Her faction's position is logically untenable. Simple resource calculation indicates inevitable capitulation within the first hour." The negotiations began with traditional diplomatic courtesy, which lasted approximately 30 seconds before degenerating into the sophisticated version of a shouting match. Kronos established the Titan Empire's superior claim through historical precedent and military capability. Vexthara countered with Naga exploration rights and subtle threats about what happened to systems that ignored serpentine interests. Kethva presented a mathematically elegant argument for Xyrian technological superiority, while BuzzClick17 buzzed about collective hive priorities that superseded individual species concerns. Maya listened. This wasn't the strategic listening taught in diplomatic academies, where you waited for your opponent to stop talking so you could begin winning. This was the kind of listening that actually processed what people were saying, analyzed why they were saying it, and identified what they weren't saying but desperately wanted to. Fascinating positions, Maya interjected during a brief pause in the civilized hostilities. "Ambassador Kronos, your historical precedent argument is particularly compelling. The Titan Exploration Charter from the Third Galactic Era definitely establishes prior claim." Kronos' massive frame straightened with surprise. No one had acknowledged his argument's validity. They'd simply tried to shout over it. However, Maya continued conversationally. Queen Vexthara raises an interesting point about current exploration rights. The Naga Consortium has been actively surveying the system for mineral deposits, which represents significant investment in development. Vexthara's serpentine head tilted with curious interest. Where was this tiny human going with such reasonable observations? And Resonance Prime Kethvar's technological analysis is absolutely correct, Meyer added, turning to the crystalline being. The Zirian Collective possesses the only extraction methods capable of safely harvesting zenithium without destabilizing the system's gravitational balance. The conference room had grown unexpectedly quiet. These beings were accustomed to having their positions attacked, dismissed, or ignored. Having them acknowledged and validated was unusual. Which brings us to an interesting problem, Maya continued, her voice maintaining the same reasonable tone one might use to discuss weather patterns. Everyone here has legitimate claims, essential capabilities, and valid concerns. Traditional diplomacy would have us fight over the scraps until one faction claims dominance and the others get nothing. She paused, looking around the room at beings whose combined mass could level city blocks. What if we tried something different? The question hung in the recycled air like an alien concept, which technically it was. Different how? Rumbled Kronos, his tone suggesting that different meant suspicious. What if instead of fighting over who gets to exclude everyone else, we figure out how everyone gets what they actually need? Maya activated her portable holographic display, showing a three-dimensional model of the Zenith system. The Titan Empire needs the rare metals for infrastructure development. The Naga Consortium wants exploration rights and trade route control. The Zirian Collective requires zenithium for their technological advancement. The Hive worlds need sustainable resource access for population expansion. She highlighted different regions of the system as she spoke. What if the Minor Trade Federation proposed a joint development compact? Titan historical claims provide legal framework. Naga exploration establishes operational parameters. Zirian technology ensures safe extraction. Hive logistics manage distribution. Everyone gets what they need. Nobody gets excluded. The silence that followed wasn't the hostile quiet of beings preparing to attack. It was the thoughtful silence of minds processing possibilities they hadn't considered. Interesting proposal, crystallized Kethvar, his harmonic frequencies shifting to analytical modes. But how would resource allocation be determined? Surely the Zirian Collective's technological contribution merits primary consideration. And there it was. Maya had hooked them with collaboration. Now she needed to land them with psychology. Actually, she said, that raises a fascinating question about value assessment. How do we measure the relative worth of historical precedent versus current investment versus technological capability versus logistical support? She paused, letting the question settle. More importantly, who gets to decide? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications became clear. Every species had assumed their contribution was obviously most valuable. Being forced to justify that assumption to competitors was uncomfortable. Perhaps, Maya continued in the same conversational tone, we could establish objective criteria for contribution assessment. Democratic evaluation of each faction's inputs, with fair representation for all parties. Democratic, hissed Vexthara, her serpentine form shifting uneasily. The Naga Consortium has never submitted to alien judgment. Oh, we wouldn't need alien judgment, Maya replied cheerfully. We'd judge ourselves. Each faction evaluates their own contribution against established criteria, then presents their assessment to the group. Completely voluntary, utterly transparent. The genius of it was becoming apparent to everyone except the participants. Maya had turned a zero-sum competition into a collaborative project where each species could maintain their dignity while acknowledging others' value. She'd made cooperation look like enlightened self-interest. 20 minutes later, they had a preliminary framework. 40 minutes later, they had resource allocation formulas. An hour later, they had a joint development compact that gave everyone more than they'd originally hoped to gain through conflict. But the real negotiation was just beginning. Supreme Arbitrator Zekthor materialized in the conference room like a crystalline mountain, deciding to attend a dinner party. At 12 feet of pure geometric perfection, he represented the pinnacle of galactic diplomatic achievement. His species, the eternal architects, had been mediating interstellar disputes since before most civilizations had discovered fire. He'd never lost a negotiation, never been outmaneuvered, never been forced to acknowledge a position he couldn't logically dismantle. Fascinating developments, he resonated, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself seem more orderly. I observe unprecedented cooperation among traditionally antagonistic factions. This suggests either revolutionary diplomatic breakthrough or elaborate deception. The temperature in the room dropped to levels usually associated with diplomatic crises. When Supreme Arbitrator Zekthor personally intervened in negotiations, it meant someone had either achieved something remarkable or violated something fundamental. Arbitrator, Maya said, rising to acknowledge his presence with appropriate respect, we've developed a collaborative framework for Zenith system development that addresses all parties' essential interests. Indeed, Zekthor crystallized, his geometric form refracting light in patterns that suggested deep analysis. Your approach demonstrates interesting innovation. However, innovation requires validation through logical scrutiny. He moved toward the holographic display with the deliberate precision of someone about to perform surgery on an idea. The fundamental assumption underlying your compact is that cooperative benefit exceeds competitive advantage. This assumption requires proof. And there it was. The trap Maya had been expecting since the moment she'd started building consensus. Zekthor wasn't just arbitrating the negotiation. He was testing whether her approach could survive contact with true diplomatic authority. You're absolutely right, Maya agreed, which seemed to surprise him. Cooperation does require proof of superior outcomes. Traditional competitive negotiation has established benchmarks for success measurement. She gestured to her fellow negotiators, who were watching this exchange with the fascination of beings witnessing either diplomatic history or spectacular failure. In competitive negotiation, success means maximizing your faction's gains while minimizing others' benefits. The winner gets optimal outcomes. Everyone else accepts suboptimal results. Zekthor's crystalline form brightened with approval. Finally, someone who understood proper diplomatic logic. However, Maya continued, that measurement assumes static resource availability and fixed technological capabilities. What if collaboration actually increases total available benefits for all parties? She activated a new holographic display showing resource extraction projections. Competitive development yields approximately 60% efficiency due to redundant infrastructure, conflicting extraction schedules, and security overhead. Collaborative development yields 92% efficiency through integrated systems and optimized logistics. The numbers hung in the air like a mathematical challenge to everything Zekthor thought he knew about negotiation theory. Interesting calculation, he crystallized slowly. However, efficiency improvements do not address fundamental power distribution concerns. Superior diplomatic position merits superior outcomes. This principle maintains galactic stability. Maya nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. That's a compelling argument for hierarchical resource allocation. The question is, what constitutes superior diplomatic position? Zekthor's geometric form seemed to sharpen with confidence. This was familiar territory. Superior position derives from combination of military capability, economic resources, technological advancement, and historical precedent. The eternal architects have refined these measurements over millennia of successful arbitration. Absolutely, Maya agreed. Your species' diplomatic achievements are legendary throughout the galaxy. No civilization questions eternal architect authority in arbitration matters. The compliments seemed to settle around Zekthor like visible satisfaction. Which raises an interesting question, Maya continued in the same respectful tone. Given your species' unparalleled diplomatic expertise, what would you consider the most important quality in a negotiator? Logic, Zekthor responded immediately. Diplomatic success requires rational analysis of available data, objective assessment of relative positions, and logical conclusion derivation. Perfect, Maya said, smiling that same pleasant smile that was becoming increasingly unsettling to everyone in the room. In that case, I have a logical question about your position. The conference room went absolutely silent. You've established that superior diplomatic position merits superior outcomes, and that position is determined by measurable capabilities. You've also established that logic must govern all diplomatic decisions. She paused, meeting his crystalline gaze directly. So here's my logical question. If the eternal architects possess superior diplomatic position due to unmatched negotiation expertise, and logic demands that superior position receive superior outcomes, shouldn't your species claim the Zenith system for themselves? The question hung in the air, like a live explosive. Zekthor's crystalline form flickered through several different refractive patterns, as his massive intellect processed the implications. The eternal architects do not engage in resource acquisition, he crystallized carefully. We provide arbitration services to maintain galactic stability. Ah, Maya said, nodding thoughtfully. So superior diplomatic position doesn't automatically claim superior material outcomes. Sometimes superior beings choose to use their position for higher purposes. Correct. Which means that the most advanced diplomatic position involves recognizing when to exercise restraint rather than dominance. Precisely. Maya's smile grew just a fraction brighter. In that case, arbitrator, I believe you've just proven that true diplomatic superiority lies in choosing cooperation over competition, even when you possess the power to simply take what you want. The silence that followed was the sound of a massive intellect, realizing it had been led into a logical trap constructed from its own stated principles. Zekthor had spent the entire conversation establishing that logic governed all diplomatic decisions, that superior position merited superior outcomes, and that the eternal architects represented the pinnacle of diplomatic evolution. Maya had then used those very principles to prove that his species' greatest achievement was their choice to facilitate rather than dominate. Furthermore, Maya continued with devastating reasonableness. If the galaxy's greatest diplomats choose cooperation over competition when they could easily claim dominance, doesn't that suggest that our collaborative compact represents the most diplomatically advanced approach to the Zenith system dispute? Zekthor's crystalline form went completely still. In the space of 5 minutes, this tiny human had used his own logical framework to prove that her approach wasn't just valid, but actually superior to traditional competitive negotiation. She'd made him argue for her position using his own stated principles. Your logic, he crystallized slowly, appears sound. Thank you, Maya replied. Coming from you, that's the highest compliment possible. Another pause as 12 feet of geometric perfection processed the full implications of what had just occurred. There is, Zekthor continued, one final consideration. Maya waited, recognizing the moment when intellectual honesty collides with institutional authority. If your collaborative approach represents superior diplomatic methodology, and logical consistency demands acknowledgement of superior approaches, then I am compelled to validate your achievement. The phrase hung in the recycled air like a confession. However, he added, validation of superior methodology traditionally requires formal acknowledgement of the superior practitioner. Maya understood. Zekthor wasn't just admitting her approach was correct. He was acknowledging that she'd out-negotiated the galaxy's greatest negotiator using nothing but his own principles and superior psychological insight. Arbitrator, she said quietly, your logical consistency and intellectual honesty are exactly why your species represents the pinnacle of diplomatic evolution. Anyone can maintain their position when challenged with force. It takes true wisdom to acknowledge truth even when it's inconvenient. Slowly, with the deliberate precision of someone making a choice that would reshape galactic diplomatic theory, Supreme Arbitrator Zekthor lowered his massive crystalline form in formal acknowledgement of superior diplomatic achievement. The Academy's conference hall had never been so quiet. 5 different apex species stared at a scene that violated everything they thought they knew about power dynamics. The greatest diplomatic authority in galactic history had voluntarily acknowledged the superiority of a human barely a tenth his size. Well, Maya said, offering a hand to help him rise despite the impossible size difference, I think that concludes today's lesson in collaborative negotiation theory. Director Vextar cleared his throat with the sound of someone whose entire curriculum had just become obsolete. Captain Chen, he announced, his voice carrying across the stunned facility, congratulations on your appointment to head the new Consensus Building Division. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. In a galaxy where size had always equaled authority, where louder meant more convincing and bigger meant better, The smallest being in the academy had just redefined what diplomatic power actually meant. Maya looked around at her stunned classmates, species who'd spent months dismissing her as a relevant decoration, and offered them the same pleasant smile she'd worn throughout the entire ordeal. "So," she said conversationally, "anyone interested in studying human collaborative methodology? I think you might find it educational." The laughter that followed wasn't mocking anymore. It was the sound of minds expanding to accommodate possibilities they'd never considered, the sound of a galaxy discovering that its fundamental assumptions about authority and influence might need comprehensive revision. After all, in a universe full of hammers looking for nails, sometimes what you really needed was someone who'd learned that the most effective tool was often a carefully placed question. And humans, it turned out, had perfected the art of making people think themselves into better decisions. The Academy would never be quite the same. Neither would galactic diplomacy. But that, as Maya would have pointed out with characteristic understatement, was probably educational too.